Welcome to the Nihung Arena. Highlighting Sikhs from around the world by showcasing their professions, passions, and perspectives. I'm your host, Mandheer Singh, aka the Nihung. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Amar Singh from the Soch Podcast. Welcome to the Nihung's Arena.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and secondly, obviously, for even arranging this. I think we've been planning it for quite some time. So to finally actually meet up and meet you as well, like meet you, it's nice. And so yeah, thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, no, we've been trying to connect for a little while, but it's okay. I'm a low pressure type guy, and I figure it's better to take our time and do it right than to rush into something. But I definitely appreciate you taking the time out. You are in the UK. I'm in the United States. So we do have like a 5-hour difference between us, and it's been kind of hard to make those schedules match up, but this is working out pretty good for me today. A little bit of background about you from what I know. I'd like you to go into more detail, but I actually found you and your podcast. So let me back up. I knew about Ramblings of a Sikh
Yep.
Twitter account because I saw that you post like historical paintings and photos. And so I was a little bit aware of you, but I really learned a lot more once you started your podcast. And I believe you've been doing it a little more than a year now or so.
Yeah.
And I actually came to you because I saw Satnam Singh on another podcast, the Kyal podcast. Mandheer Singh and his buddy, I forget what his name was. They did a couple episodes of a podcast, and I caught them during the pandemic because I was at home, not doing much. And they were the ones that kind of inspired me to start my podcast because I started in August or September of 2020.
Okay.
And I heard Satnam Singh on their podcast. And I guess I was Googling him or something, and I came across the Soch Podcast, which Satnam Singh was your first guest.
Yep.
And I listened to that, and there was a couple of things, and I want to tell you some things before I let you get into some things on your own. But one thing is, what struck me is your voice. You have a very good podcast type voice. It's deep and it's clear, and it sounds very sophisticated. Now that might just be an idiot American hearing a British accent and thinking it sounds so smart. But I remember immediately getting that feeling of like watching a documentary or something where you have this very clear way of speaking and it's a very deep, rich voice. And I was like, this guy is made for this.
Thank you for that. That's really nice.
So how did you get into podcasts? You seem to be a huge history buff, and I heard a little bit of your background in your podcast.
Yeah.
But like, what inspired you Sikhi-wise? What inspired you to dig deep into history? And then how did you get to starting the Soch Podcast?
Oh gosh. Okay. No. Well, first of all, thank you for the bit you said at the end, because that's kind of a huge encouragement, really, because I think I'm sure you might have a similar thing, which is when you're doing it, you're sometimes like, am I doing a good job, or is this actually working, or are people really paying attention? And you can look at numbers and stats, but actually to hear feedback like that, like I definitely appreciate it. Rewinding then in terms of explaining kind of background and like journey into this. So in terms of the actual kind of immediacy of creating this podcast and setting it up, so Ramblings of a Sikh itself actually came about as an accident, and what I mean by that is I was doing. Okay, let me rewind a little bit.
Yeah.
I come from a what we call second migration family. So my father was born in Africa. His mother was also born in Africa, and his parents were also born in Africa, but his grandparents were from India, Punjab, obviously, right? So they then, thanks to kind of everything that happens in Uganda in the kind of late 60s and obviously opening into the 70s.
Is that like all the Idi Amin stuff? And
yeah. So as kind of a bit of a tangent here, my dad's dad, so my Babaji, my grandfather, when they were in Kenya, they were essentially kind of owners of one of the biggest sawmills that existed at that time. And he was quite heavily involved with the politics of the area. So essentially around kind of the 70s, he just disappears one day. My grandma, the family, no one has any idea what's going on. And this is at a time when wealthy Asians are being kidnapped and held ransom. And essentially, cutting a long story short, what happens is they get a phone call off him, and he's actually in London, and he says, "You need to pack your bags, grab the kids, and come over." So they turn up in England in 1972 with about £5 in their pocket.
Oh wow!
And kind of that's the trajectory of the family ever since. And I have to all kind of admiration to my grandma, because my grandfather died quite quickly after coming here. So she essentially had to raise my father and his brothers completely on her own in one of the most racist places of the country up north, in a little place called Stockton-upon-Tees. And they went through it all. They went through absolutely everything.
Even the idea that you would have to pack up and move from Kenya to London, a mother with the kids and pick everything up. Even that alone is admirable, to have the wherewithal to pack up, get everybody out and make that move on your own.
And it was a huge move. So just to put it into context, the house that they lived in, Queen Elizabeth had stayed in prior to them purchasing it. So it was like they lived like kings, and overnight it was just turned upside down.
Oh my gosh.
My grandma, basically, as most, I think it's quite a common British Sikh kind of diaspora story, which is parents or grandparents essentially working 2-3 jobs, very manual labor jobs, making ends meet, putting food and clothes on the kids' back, and basically getting them through education, life, marriage, everything else that goes with that. Because I then come from my parents, my father obviously has this mixed Sikh, African, Punjabi background. And then on top of that, my mom she was born in a place called St. Helens near Liverpool. Her mother herself, like my grandma, was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Christian, born and bred in, again, Liverpool. Oh, wow. My nana is a Hindu Bengali Brahmin who was born and raised in Calcutta. He met my grandma at the University of Sheffield in the late 50s, I believe. I might have that wrong. And they got married and everything else. So my heritage and my background, as you can imagine, is very complicated. And when I mean complicated, it's just really beautiful, because I don't it's just a tapestry of just different people and backgrounds.
Yeah. And I've also noticed, when you talk to other people, you often ask them about their family history and how they came. And I always wondered, it seemed like you were always fascinated with that. Now I understand, having such a complicated history yourself, it's very important to understand people's backgrounds, because then you can see how similar your journey is and where the differences are.
And even all of that comes within this macro story of actually all our ancestral and background history actually weaves this huge story of migration, empire. If we're honest, my parents, when I say my parents, my ancestors wouldn't have left Punjab to go to Africa if it wasn't for the fact that the British Empire at that time was expanding. And on top of that, my grandparents wouldn't have had to left East Africa had kind of that process of decolonization not been happening, because obviously you had East Africans who were going through their own process of kind of becoming independent, and that took its own form. But everyone's stories, and especially over the last kind of those who are sharing it recently, they're very much a story of the last 100 years. And I think what I really enjoy from that is picking out the similarities, but also the differences, and also the amazing parts. I like to pick out the bits that show we're not all like a homogenous one group. So when people say Sikh, they always have this idea of a Punjabi person who is normally quite tall, quite dark skin, beard, turban, very kind of a stereotypical image.
Right.
But I've spoken to some people, and it turns out that their grandparents were actually from Burma, but then when World War II happened, they had to move into India. And when they reached the border, the security told them, you can't take anything. You have to leave everything you own in Burma. And so they end up in India as refugees. And I think one thing that we can all relate to as people of color is just the sheer kind of toil and labor that I have to say I'm very privileged. I've not had to do that. But if you look at like my parents, grandparents, and to be honest, a lot of people listening to this, I'm sure they can share in the fact that they've had to go through a hell of a lot just to get to wherever we are today.
Right.
Rewinding that slightly then.
Okay.
Because I had such a complex background, I was immersed in everything. So when I mean that, I mean like we went to a Gurdwara I'd say every day. It was a routine with my father when we were going to primary school and secondary school, thanks to them being so close to the Gurdwara, that we'd go to the Gurdwara every morning before school.
I see. So was it like walking distance, or was it you had to drive?
No, we had to drive. Yeah. So I was very lucky in the fact that my dad was an entrepreneur, so he had his own business. And in the mornings on the way to work, he'd take us to Gurdwara, drop us off to school, and then go to work himself.
How big was the community? Because it's kind of hard for me to imagine, because I grew up in Ohio. Ohio is a very heartland of America, a lot of farm fields. There was only like a few families, and in the beginning, we only had Gurdwara twice a year.
Wow.
We didn't have a building. We would rent a place twice a year. Basaki and Guru Nanak Dev's Gurpurab. We'd rent a building, have a little program. And then after 84, we started doing it twice a month.
Okay.
So still, then eventually they bought a building, but they still only had Gurdwara because we didn't have a bai. We didn't have granthis. We didn't have anything. We did everything. We learned how to do the path, the kirtan, sukhasa, and everything. So we had nothing to compare to. So when you say that we went to Gurdwara every day, that's amazing to me.
Well, to put it into context, so the area that we live in a city called Coventry, which is probably about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours drive from London. So we're kind of in the middle of the country, so to speak.
Right.
The kind of, I guess it's the English equivalent of a state, I guess, but it's a county, and so it's the West Midlands is quite heavily saturated with Sikhs.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is so during the 60s, when there was kind of this labor shortage in England and kind of the empire answered, huge swathes of Punjabis and obviously then in the 70s, people from East Africa, again, though Sikhs, settled around here because there were just loads of factories, and that's where we could get our jobs. My family actually ended up here because of, again, there was already a Sikh family that had settled here, and they essentially somehow had made a connection with my grandma and just recommended, saying there's loads of Sikhs here, kind of come and live here.
Okay.
However, at the same time, we're still a minority. Yeah. So there's obviously a lot of us in order for us to have. So to put it into context, the city that I live in has 7 or 8 gurdwaras that are pretty much open 24/7. Yeah. So as a comparison of what you were saying, kind of twice a month. And so there is a large Sikh community. So we'd go to Gurdwara kind of almost every day. On top of that, really interesting things when I look back on now is like, so ZTV, when I was growing up during the 90s, had the Mahabharat series.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you remember, but it really took hold of everyone. Right. And what would happen is my grandma's friend would record them on VHS, give them to my grandma, and then we'd watch them together. And she'd basically pause the VHS at kind of 5-10 minute intervals and then explain to me what happened. Because I'd watch it and I'd love it because it was kind of almost like a superhero-ish type thing.
It's like the Indian Avengers.
Yeah. And it's amazing because you're like, they look like me and it kind of seems quite at home. And so I grew up with this very kind of multifaceted upbringing. On top of that, my dad was heavily into kind of reading and research and just sharing kind of all sorts. So people like, I don't know whether you've heard of someone called Professor Dr. Kohli. So he used to write, Dr. Surinder Singh Kohli, he used to write loads of books and all sorts on kind of Sikh history and philosophy.
Right, okay.
For some reason, Dad happened to know him. And again, kind of, you'd end up going to visit these people. And at the time, I had no idea or no interest in what was really going on. I grew up with that. On top of that, as most Asian households could probably relate to, I also grew up with the typical kind of objectives of do really well in your education, kind of get top grades and all the rest of it.
Right.
And I grew up with an older brother who like got 100% in his exams and like stupid things like that. So it was kind of expected, right? And I don't know what the equivalent is in the US, but around kind of 16 in the UK, you do something called your GCSEs, which are kind of like national exams.
No, we don't have anything like that here.
And it's kind of like then it helps then dictate what college you get into. And
well, so I guess if you were to compare, maybe you could say the SATs and the ACTs, they're standardized tests that you take that based on your score help you get into what college, but you get like it's based on your score. It's not like a ranking.
Yeah, but this again though, college here doesn't mean the same as it does over there. So college for us means so college here means the bit between your GCSEs and university. So kind of 16 to 18. And so basically what happened was our school had this really kind of stupid, at the time it wasn't stupid, but looking back, I now kind of regret it. They had this idea that if you got over a certain grade in your subject, they'd put you a year ahead.
Oh, okay.
So I ended up doing my history and maths GCSE a year early. And obviously,
so you were always kind of into history, or you were good at history,
always from the start. So I remember in year, I must have been like maybe 10 or 11ish. I remember in primary school, there was some type of like homework which was to do research on the Greeks and the Romans, and I started to read into it. I put together some like ridiculous presentation, and I just remember the teacher like really commending me for it, and I was like, ooh. I think I've got I've uncovered something that I'm good at. Yeah,
you were actually interested in it.
Yeah. And I just found it amazing because I was like, what? Like, it's just entering like a new world. So I did my history GCSE a year early. I did really well in that. I then did my A-level a year early, which is kind of your pre-university exams that help dictate what university you get into. And again, I did really well in it. Really enjoyed it, really loved it. And then
we're talking about like the mid 90s now, some mid to late 90s. No.
So I would have been at school. This is like 2008.
So So I'm way off on that.
Yeah. So 2008.
Wait, so you're like 30 years old?
Yeah. I'm literally 30 years old. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So that makes sense. We're 2022 now. So
yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So around 2008. So, and then on top of that, there was always this kind of urge to like want to know more or want to find out more just in general, because I guess in a way 1984 also had a huge impact, because I remember on the 20th at the 20th year anniversary of it at the local Gurdwara, there was this presentation. And I just remember walking through, it was like a gallery. And I remember walking through it and seeing all of the images of kind of the bodies and what had happened. And it burnt a visceral kind of stamp in the back of my brain. And I was like 2004, I'm like 13, 14. Right. So I'm kind of at this point trying to figure out things, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I remember kind of talking to my dad being like, I think I figured out what I want to do, which is I want to become a lawyer and then take the people who have done this to court. And I essentially wanted to seek some type of justice is at that point is what my objective was. That then kind of developed into, all right, when I go to university, what could I study? So I applied for history at pretty much everywhere, and then law. And then cutting a long story short, I ended up doing a history degree.
Okay.
And I loved it. I mean, I absolutely loved it. I would do it again. I'm kind of sad that I didn't continue to do like a master's or a PhD afterwards.
Right.
But again, I got the opportunity though during that to essentially look at Sikh history and look at kind of what you could quote unquote call my or our history, like my ancestry. So for my second year at university, I did a project on, I can't remember what the title was, but it was essentially looking at how the Ret Maryada had been formulated and how it had developed over kind of the 17th to 20th centuries.
Okay.
And I got a really good score on it. So I was like, brilliant, this is fantastic. I think I'm onto something. And then also Ramblings then was, as I was saying all the way at the beginning, was an accident. And why it was an accident was because at university, what had happened was I got there. I went to Royal Holloway, University of London. There wasn't a Sikh society. And they're kind of like a staple of British universities. Like you have all these societies, and Sikh societies are normally quite big. And someone eventually set one up, and they invited like the local Gurdwara Pradhan or whoever. And he came, and as the typical kind of Punjabi thing is, or Sikh thing is it's kind of like, oh yeah, like it's Sikh society, we should just go just to kind of like to show our face or whatever.
Yeah.
So we went, and I was expecting something, considering it was university, I was expecting something kind of like half decent, something that was a little bit better than your usual Punjabi school for kids type lecture, right?
Right. Don't just tell us Sakhis and things like actually something maybe more academic or a little bit substantial. Yeah.
Just something that like a university student is going to sink his teeth into and go, this is juicy.
Right.
And it was the complete opposite. I still remember to this day, it was horrible. It was like, yeah, Sikhs believe in one God. We have 10 gurus. We have 5 Panth. We have Panch Pyare. We have this. And I was just sat there going, oh, just someone put me out of my misery. And at this time as well at university, I was exploring things like Sikhi doesn't even accept, in my opinion, doesn't even accept the Judeo-Christian paradigm of this divine God entity. And the closest thing you could probably get to it is like panentheism and all the rest of it. So just the stuff he was saying, I would love to have engaged with him. But even when I asked questions, it was just really like blunt.
No, I know what you're saying, because in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, I got involved with a lot of the retreats here, which were camps for college and young professional kids, right? So we would try to organize these things. And now when you're talking to people, you got to talk differently. Like if someone says Sikhs believe there is one God, well, how are you defining God? Because God has a certain image that it conjures when you say the word God, and it's a very Christian image. So now, are you talking about a powerful person? Or, and you got to really dig in and say, what does that actually mean? Now, should we say there is one God? Should we say God is one? Should we even use the word God?
Well, exactly.
So, yeah. I can understand your frustration, because if you're not engaging at the level of your audience, you're just going to turn them away, right? You're going to turn them away from Sikhi, which is the opposite effect of what you want.
So that Sikh Society lecture kind of sparked a fire, and I was like, I have quite a hot temperament, so kind of a little bit of a tangent. I remember in when I was at primary school, so like I don't know, 7 or 8, I used to have anger management classes because I used to get really angry at school, right? So I've been a complete little git throughout my life. So when sorry, so I completely lost. No,
you were saying that Sikh Society.
So I was just hot. I was just like, all right, I need to do something. What should I do? Like, what can I do? Whatever. Yeah. And I lived with this girl at the time that, again, had attended the Sikh Society. Really, really nice woman. And I remember going to her, like, what can I do? What should I do? And, like, I'm really kind of upset about this. Perhaps I should kind of get involved with the Sikh Society. And then I was like, don't think that's going to work, because if this is kind of the trajectory they're going, I'm almost like the boogie monster, right?
Right.
So I thought, all right, let me just start a blog. And during the late 2000s, like we're talking now 2010. So at this point, blogs are kind of like the in thing.
Yeah.
To start one now, I don't know whether it would quite work, but again, like that was the plan. So what I did was I just wrote how I felt about the lecture, and all I had done was I just taken notes during the lecture, and I just wrote essentially my critique on it. So I was like, matey says X, Y, and Z. This is why I don't accept X, Y, and Z is correct. Yeah. I don't think that blog actually exists anymore. It's that old. And that just kind of slowly started to grow. And then as I was researching during university, I would just kind of share snippets. So that essay I was talking about earlier about kind of tracking and kind of mapping the development of the Death Miradda, I'd post snippets and people seemed to like it. A lot of people also really hated it, but the point wasn't to try and kind of create a definitive definition of this is what a Sikh is or this or that. It was partly, and I guess actually, to be honest, it was probably a lot more to do with, it was just my own journey and I was sharing things as I was going through that.
Yeah. And it's not a bad idea. It's a good idea for us to challenge the status quo, right? Like, let's say you're completely wrong. It's still good for you to question, right? That's still because now someone like me who might be convinced of one point of view, I get challenged. If I can't defend my point of view, then I should have the self-awareness to think, okay, do I really believe what I'm saying? And do I need to re-examine this? And maybe I will come up with a better defense of what I believe. Yeah. Or I might change my mind. I have to be open.
Or you might actually point something out to me that makes me go, ooh, I missed that. Let me go back to the drawing board and I'll start again. And I think for me, that was kind of the driving force, which was, all right, I'm just going to share what I can. And it slowly started to develop.
And it got engagement. You got engagement out of it.
Yeah. People seem to like it. And then again, it wasn't like I didn't set out with any plan in mind or anything like that. And that just kind of slowly developed. And then in my final year at university, Satnam, the guy who you found the podcast, happened to have got in touch with my dad because he had flown over to Denmark to help in a Sikh camp or something or another, where Satnam's based. And Satnam at the time was doing a study on, I think it was to do with like how diaspora Sikhs were taking interest into kind of their history and culture or something along those lines. I can't quite remember. Yeah. But as a result of his study and my dad having met him, we got in touch because he wanted to interview me about the rambling stuff and about just kind of what I was doing at that point in time.
Because you were the subject of what he's studying, essentially. Yeah. You're a diaspora Sikh that's interested in history and things.
Yeah. And he wanted a particular kind of demographic and I obviously fit the age and all the rest of it. So at that point, obviously made a connection with him. And then on top of it, like there were other kind of things going on. So, I'm sure you've heard of Nanak Naam and Basics of Sikhi.
Yeah, so I know Satpal Singh. I know.
The people behind those guys. So Satpal Singh, again, like when he was at university, spent a lot of time at our house. And again, like he was almost like a fat, almost like growing up, he was like an uncle almost. Again, the Basics of Sikhi, Jagraj, when I was going to university, there was a lot of interaction with him. Another academic, Gamal Roop, who's written and got a PhD in Dasam Granth, is a very close family friend. Yeah. So all of these people had the influence on me in the sense of they were all individuals doing something very similar, which was investigating for themselves whatever was of interest to them.
Well, you know what's really interesting too, that group of people you just named, they have very unique perspectives and philosophies that very different from each other.
And that's the bit that I absolutely loved. Because I remember one day we were sat in Satpal's living room. It was my father, Gamal Roop, Satpal, Jagraj and myself. And we were actually on the way, like my dad was on the way to drop me to university and Satpal lived kind of nearby-ish. And we were all basically I got an essay back and I had got marked down because the lecturer didn't agree with the way that I structured my essay. So for me, if I don't agree with the other side of the other viewpoint, I won't include it in the essay itself. As I'm putting forward my argument, I will critique it and kind of give the other side. And that was essentially the debate. And everyone gave forward their point. And what I really enjoyed from that was it was just a debate. It was just a conversation between just like we are now. There was no friction. There was no, and as you rightly said, they all have very distinct or quite unique viewpoints or perspectives. But the beauty and the thing that still resonates with me, and I always kind of go back to that when people ask me about this, is the fact that you had all of these Sikhs sat in a room discussing things. And to be honest, it was quite a trivial matter, but I've experienced them discuss more serious things. And again, just to be able to experience something like that and have it at a kind of a particular level was just a thing of beauty.
No, that's a lot of brain power you had in that room.
Oh, hell yeah. And you can imagine, as we're talking about it, it obviously influenced me quite a lot. Anyway, so graduated with a history degree, didn't want to become an academic or a journalist at the time. I kind of had this idea that I need to get a high paying job, like basically like Babylon. I was a slave of Babylon. I was just like a slave to the system. I was like, all right, I want a high paying job. Also, I had gone to a university near London. All of my friends were in London. And kind of you have this idea of you'll leave university, get a graduate scheme or something, and you'll be living it up. I ended up doing another degree in law near home. I absolutely hated it. It was just, it was probably the worst 2 years I've spent doing anything. But I was kind of like, all right, I need to make a sacrifice to kind of make things work. From that point, for kind of when I started the second degree, Ramblings of a Sikh was almost just like when I say non-existent, I wasn't really paying it any attention, putting any effort or time into it.
Because at this point, it's just a blog.
Yeah, it's just a blog.
Yeah,
it's literally just a blog.
Yeah.
There's obviously like social media page, I think on Facebook and on Twitter. Yeah. But again, it's just to kind of post whatever I had written on the blog.
Yeah, it wasn't back to the blog, right?
Yeah, it wasn't anything special. So that happened, and then kind of fast forward to maybe, I don't know, maybe like 2018, 2019, maybe a little bit before that, but kind of in the last few years, recently. There's an account and a podcast called the Sikh Archive, and that started. And at the time, I didn't know who it was, and I really, really admired just the work that account was doing. And then I think maybe like 2 years ago, I had the kind of the pleasure to actually talk to the host of it, Sukhraj, because he's again a close friend of Satnam. So we just got talking, and just like we're now doing, we just went off on a tangent, started talking, got into some debates and some kind of philosophical arguments. And all sorts of things, like, I mean, contemporary stuff like, should mixed marriages be allowed, to kind of historically philosophical stuff like, if the gurus have multiple wives, what is the kind of the explanation for that? And just questioning and trying to figure stuff out.
Right.
And he is the one who said, I think you should do a podcast. And I was like, why? I was like, you already do one. And what's the point? I was like, I'd rather kind of support you in what you do and work behind the scenes, because to be honest, I don't really want to put myself out there at the moment. And like, why don't we do that? And he was like, no, I think you should do one, like your perspective and this and that and the other. And I thought, okay, all right. Maybe, and just parked it. Like I didn't really put much attention to it. And then lockdown happened, and COVID kicked in, right? Yeah. And I think there's only so much you can do in kind of the confines of your own space, or even like once lockdown eased and we were able to go out a bit more. Like there's only so much kind of you could read or you could do. And that kind of got merged then with my other objective, which is, as a historian, I've always obviously kind of wanted to trace my own ancestry backwards and just see how far I could get. And on my father's side, and I think, to be honest, most people of color could relate to this, is it's very difficult to trace family back unless you've got like old relatives who remember things, or you've got something written in
there's no records past our grandparents, really. It's
so difficult. And on top of that, most of the records our grandparents probably have, they all start with the 1st of January, whatever year.
My dad's birthday is January 1st.
Yeah. So my granddad has 2 birthdays, obviously 1st of January and then his actual birthday. And he always tells us off for not saying happy birthday to him on both. But anyway, so because I've kind of wanted to investigate kind of my own family history and figure things out, I kind of signed up to those like ancestry web pages and tried to go through archives and find stuff. Again, proved almost impossible. Spoke to family members, got kind of as far back as I could. And then I was like, all right, I think I need to go the long way around, which is I need to start just reading around the area related to why we moved or why East Africa went in, like just to try and figure things out and put names to places and kind of work the hard way. Then I thought, all right, what's a quicker way of doing this? And I was like, a quicker way of doing this is talking to people who have already done the work. So forget reading about it. Just talk to the person who's done the work, ask them the questions, and hopefully you'll get somewhere. So then I started picking, I thought, okay, I'll pick someone's brain who I thought could help, who's Amandeep Madra behind the UK Punjab Heritage Association. And I was like, this is what I'm doing. I'm trying to figure out my own kind of ancestry and the history. This is the Pind that I've been told our family come from, but I've been told there was a Pind before that they came from, and no one could tell me what it is. And this was before kind of the announcement of the project that they'd been working on in relation to kind of mapping enlistment in Punjab. And he shared the records with me of the Pind. And I went, oh, this is very interesting. So shared it with my grandma, and she was like, I don't recognize any of the names on here. So I was like, great, back to square one. But what it showed to me just in that example was I could achieve a lot more just by talking to people.
Yeah, make the connections.
Definitely. And then whilst I was reading stuff, I thought, all right, I need to make this kind of worth the time. So I thought, as I'm reading, let's just share bits of information, because you just go down all sorts of rabbit holes. And so I started again posting on Instagram. And people were like, oh, you're back. And I was like, what? I was like, what does that mean? I was like, I was like, I haven't even been doing anything. So I thought, all right, let's see what happens. That started to gain traction. And then I was like, all right, let's see where I can take this almost. So I put a list together of, I think, 25 people who I thought I'd like to interview and talk to, reached out to a whole load of people. A lot of them said no, a lot of them said yes. And I was like, brilliant, let's kind of see what we could do with it. Started the first few podcasts. It seemed to go all right, I thought. And then because kind of there was already kind of some interaction on social media, it was easier to kind of direct people to the podcasts.
Yeah.
And then kind of it's just organically developed. So it kind of started off with just posting on Instagram and kind of Twitter. That's then grown into these podcasts, which have then kind of gone from audio only and being on just like podcast players to then kind of being video and audio, and then being on YouTube, and then just trying to essentially just trying to grow it and make it self-sufficient.
I've noticed that you've kind of ramped things up recently. You're doing a lot more promotion and stuff, but I got to tell you a couple of things. So, I'm a real estate investor. I buy houses, fix them up, and sell them. Right. I mostly work in Michigan, but I had this project last year in New Jersey. Okay, that's about a 9 to 10 hour drive from here. Yeah. So all last year, every month for about a week at a time, I was driving back and forth to New Jersey, sometimes multiple times in a month. And I would listen to your podcast. I would. And at first I was just like looking for stuff to kind of fill the time, but then I was binge listening, because it's a 9 hour drive. So now I'm binge listening, and I'd catch up, because I would listen to it on Spotify, and I would catch up, and then I would say, oh man, I'm out of episodes. I really wanted to hear the next, something next. But I'll tell you, there's a couple of things, man. Okay. First of all, for me, my background when we got into Sikhi after 84, okay, that's kind of when we became more aware and we decided we were all cut hair family, all this kind of stuff. My brother and I started keeping our hair. My mom kept her hair, and eventually my dad kept hair, and we all took Amrit and things like this. Okay. But our circle was mostly Akhand Kirtani Jatha. Okay. Our family specifically, we were lucky that we had a lot of exposure. We had exposure to Damdami Taksal. We had uncles like Dr. Mandheer Singh Sandhu, who did the translation of Pindram Wale's speeches. He was close by. He was a close friend. I would go visit him. And a couple of people, there's Kuldeep uncle here who ran camps that were more Sikh missionary style. So, and then we had the Dodra Sangat, and so we had and then different camps that we went to. So even though our main influence was with Akhand Kirtan Jatha, our closeness was there, we were luckily exposed to a lot of different people. Similar to how you were saying, you had all these different people who were kind of at the top of their game or whatever. And so for me in the 90s, one of the things that I was kind of involved in from the very beginning is I created akj.org. That was kind of the thing that Nihung, that's how Nihung came out of the 90s. I used to do graphic design. I used to do Windows themes with kundas and things like that, And so then one of my buddies called me the Rocking Net Nihung, And so I just dropped the rocking, made a logo. And then the 90s, I would make websites like akj.org and some student association websites and a couple other ones. Like I had even built this thing I called the Shaheed Access System, where I made a database and I started databasing Shaheeds, their pictures, and put a little bit of their history. I started this thing and I never finished it. And then I lost all the stuff that I'd done. I don't know. It was on some hard drive somewhere. And I kind of really regret that. It was kind of an underground site, but that's more what I did was underground stuff. Right. But at that time, there was nothing out there like that. Like if you wanted to listen to Kirtan online, you couldn't, there was no MP3s. MP3s had just come out. Yeah. As a matter of fact, I was one of the first people that put Kirtan on MP3s and put it online. Okay. And I created an icon and stuff, and I would start to see it on different music sites and things like that. So it was fun. But the big thing was we put a message board on there. And that changed everything. Because now all of a sudden you have people from around the world, they're coming in, they want to argue. And I was an admin, but I was like a technical admin. I didn't really represent the Jatha because, like I said, we were Jatha related or Jatha adjacent, but we weren't like AKJs, like walk around, with this label or something. And so then every time I would post something, I would get attacked from everybody. AKJs used to attack me because they didn't like it that I gave the other argument sometimes. Yep. They would be like, hey, you can't do that. You are an admin. You have to toe this message line. And then I would get attacked by other people, like Dr. Kamal Roop Singh. He was one of them. He used to argue with people on there. He used to argue with me, kind of make fun of me, things like that. And it was stupid arguments, the AKJs are fighting with this group and Damdami Taksal is saying this. And then you have this group here that would come in and pick a fight, Keski's not a kakar. And then all the AKJs would jump in and say, of course it's a kakar, and then that message board kind of changed the dynamic of things. Well, it was a couple of years it ran like that. And then I kind of left and kind of disassociated with the whole website. But the reason I was telling you that was kind of where I learned how other smart people, other smart Sikhs who are into Sikhi from a totally different perspective were making these intelligent arguments that I wasn't hearing. I was in an echo chamber, right? Yeah. And so I started to think like that too. Like, I got to get out of this echo chamber. Let me hear the criticisms. I don't, and people are going to give me a lot of crap for stuff like this, but I don't want to just hear that Keski is a kakar and why Kes is not the kakar. I want to hear the historical evidence of why Kes is the kakar, and I'll make up my own mind.
Yes.
Same thing with
the proof.
Eating meat or not eating meat, reading Ragmala or not reading Ragmala, whether the gurus had multiple wives or not. Like a lot of things you're talking about, like these things that people, how should I say this? People have a revisionist history based on their beliefs, right? So I have a belief system. I will go back and rewrite all of history to match that viewpoint because it can't be anything else.
Yeah.
Right. So I didn't want to be in that mentality. So one thing that happened to me, very similar to you, once this pandemic hit, I was kind of bored, can't do anything. A couple of my buddies, we would get on Zoom meetings and just hang out like once a week or something. We were like, we should really make this into a podcast. So they didn't really want to do it together as a group because a lot of stuff we say probably shouldn't get out. But, my buddy Ravi, he was like, hey, I'll test it out. Let's try it. That was my first episode was with him. It was about camping. And he talks about his camping trips and how he goes camping out for a week into the woods and comes back, So that was kind of how I got started too. And I thought, I want to do something that brings all these different perspectives from people on whatever they're an expert. As long, you're into Sikhi, you're an expert at something. Let's talk about it. I want to hear about it. And this is the reason I brought all that up is because I was getting to, when I was listening to your podcast, you opened my eyes to a couple things that never really registered with me. I have very little that I would agree with Dr. Kamal Roop Singh on, but I can defer the fact that look at his education. Look at how much research he's done. He's extremely knowledgeable. I am not. So my disagreeing with someone who has that level of expertise doesn't really mean much. It's just a personal opinion versus an expert opinion now. But what I heard, some things I heard him say, and even when you talked about art and history, I started to realize that a lot of this is not literal. And when we approach the artwork, these paintings, historical paintings, or we approach certain stories, especially things in Dasam Granth, as literal, they're not going to make sense. But when you understand the time period that it's written and what these things mean and symbolize, then it starts to make a lot more sense. Mandheer Singh, he was on, and he's controversial. A lot of people are going to say, why would you even want to talk to him? He's not a Sikh, he's not this and that. But my God, he said some things on your podcast that were so eye-opening. Like, we'd always hear these stories about Guru Gobind Singh, on the battlefield with 8 arms, and you see these paintings of him with 8 arms. Mandheer Singh explained what that painting actually meant, that there's those 8 hand strikes and each arm represents that. So what it is actually a depiction of is Guru Sahib's expertise in this martial arts, not that he's a Hindu goddess.
Yeah.
Right? So getting that perspective on history and art, then you start to realize, okay, you can have a certain view of Sikhi that we've very neatly packaged and created and said, this is how I'm going to follow. And then you have this messy history, different people's perspectives and different stories. And when you start to think about that, you start to realize the truth, maybe it can be revealed to you. Okay, maybe it can be somehow divine intervention and you can understand the truth. But the truth is not as straightforward as people think.
No.
And I think it was on your podcast. I'm trying to think who was it that talked about the different kind of shields and armor, like Hari Singh Nalwa and during Maharaja Ranjit Singh's time.
That was Devinder Singh Tood that was discussing his collection. So
yes.
He's got a brilliant collection of arms, artifacts.
That really opened my mind to something else too. I was thinking about that. Like every once in a while, I'll wear like a Superman shirt, or something, right? Or a Batman logo. I put that shirt on my Facebook profile. I have my Superman shirt on, my arms crossed, whatever. I do that and I feel a certain way, right?
Yeah.
And I know what I'm projecting too. Like if let's say I'm a soldier in the US Army and I put a Superman patch on my shoulder, does that mean I worship Superman? Does that mean I believe Superman is real? Or does that mean I am embodying the strength and values of this character that inspires me?
Yeah.
Then to hear Hari Singh Nalwa has a weapon that has Hanuman on it makes sense. Now you're like, of course, this is the superhero story. He's projecting himself as that hero on the battlefield. He's embodying those values. It doesn't mean that he worshiped Hanuman.
Yeah. Yeah, completely.
Right. So those things started to click with me listening to your podcast. I mean, these are things I thought about, like I didn't really get into so much, but I guess hearing somebody who was an expert on these artifacts, hearing someone who understood the history behind them, why it might be gold, because most Sikhs are like, oh, Gursikhs wouldn't have gold thing. Well, maybe they would if it represented something. Imagine if somebody's going to fight you and they come out with a gold shield, you'd be it could be intimidating.
But it's also, I think, like, so I don't disagree with any of that. I think what we try and aim to do is, like, even kind of your example of like a Superman patch, like Superman itself in this modern age has such a cultural meaning, reference, and kind of everything that goes with that. Now, for some people, they may worship Superman, and that's absolutely fine. And again, going to like the Hari Singh Nalwa comparison, having Hanuman, having Chandima, having what we would now define as Hindu gods and goddesses, doesn't necessarily mean that they're worshipping them in the sense that they are the definitive creator, kind of sustainer, destroyer. Right. Like I think one thing that I find quite interesting that people do with Sikhi is we kind of like just create little sections and kind of cut it off from its entirety. So a lot of people are like, oh, there's no way that Sikhs could ever have had these kind of Hindus, goddesses and gods on their art or on their arms or on whatever, because that's just not Sikh. But you got to realize our understanding of what a Sikh is today is so different to the understandings that would have existed at that time. And I think you've also got to remember there's stuff like even in the Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji, even in Dasam Granth, there is Bani that references these entities. Now, one thing that I like to point out is that it's very clear within Gurbani that these Devis and Devta have a particular place within everything, which is they, again, fall prey to their homme, and they are not the be-all and end-all. They're not the Akal Purukh. They're not the divine. They're not the Ik. They are not what is being worshipped, if that makes sense. Right. They are representations, and I think there's a really good book, I can't remember who it's by, but it's essentially about myths. And I think one thing we've got to understand is at that time, the gurus are talking to a culture that understands nothing else. Right. We're talking about Sikhi, like 500 years after? Right. Like there's a huge amount of history that's come before us to create a very particular image and a very particular understanding. Now, go back to Guru Nanak Dev Ji's time and ask someone who is a Sikh. I think it'd be a little bit harder than perhaps doing it today. Now, that's not to say that they're not Sikh, but our understanding of what Sikh is it changes obviously over time.
Oh, for sure. I mean, one thing we know that there were people who would be considered Muslim that considered themselves Sikhs of the Guru, right? And let's kind of cut all of the crap, so to speak, which is, I think with my podcast, the beauty of it is that I get to talk to some really, really brilliant individuals, right, about some quite complex topics, and we're just frank and honest about it. Like I'm not there to try and prove someone right or wrong. I have my own biases that I try to limit, but again, I'm more than happy to accept that I've got them. Right. But it's just to try and just create something that's a little bit intellectual, a little bit kind of more than just touching the surface, and something that, again, is quite fact-based or at least evidence-based. Because I think one thing with a lot of people now, especially in the age of fake news, is people want not a definitive kind of understanding, but something that they can go, all right, let me then use this to move forward with or whatever. But ultimately, the podcast, in the grand scheme of things, in the kind of the structure of Sikhi, is technically, it's a waste of time. Like fundamentally, if we boil Sikhi down to its fundamentals, Sikhi's fundamentals are to recognize your ego, to essentially dissolve it and become one with however you want to define the divine, to become essentially the definition of a mystic. And that's what at the heart all of our gurus were.
the idea of the guruship obviously developed and turned into the royalty that we have with the later gurus, but at its heart, that's what that is. And I think, although the podcast doesn't necessarily touch upon that at the moment, or I haven't had the opportunity yet to kind of delve into a topic related to that, ultimately, in my opinion, that is what Sikhi is. But I also understand that for a lot of people, that's almost like we've skipped over so much understanding and kind of just conversation to actually get to that point. And the podcast is, I guess, then like an intermediary, which is, all right, here's something that is just slightly kind of angled left to the objective, because hopefully through discovering and exploring more, it will answer some questions for people. Hopefully then they can go off and develop and find out even more, because as I said, I'm not trying to create a definitive like series of podcasts on what Sikhi is.
And I feel that, because I never felt like you were trying to convince me of anything, but I did feel like you were opening up perspectives or giving me resources to hear the full thought, not just somebody's criticism of something. But going back to something, I just want to make the point. I don't think Sikhs today are really any different than they were in Guru Sahib's time overall. Now, let me just elaborate on that a little bit. There were people that were very dedicated to the Guru physically. They were there doing Guru Seva and they were around them all the time. There were some people that were very dedicated to the things that the Guru was saying, and sometimes even questioned the Guru if the Guru wasn't following what they themselves interpreted the Guru to be teaching. You had people that betrayed the Guru. You had some people that were kind of following because they like to live their own life. You have artists that see the Guru a certain way and represent the Guru based on their artistic perspective. And people that sing and all. We have that today. We have people that do dharmic songs. We have people that do artwork. We have people that are doing podcasts. We have people that are, like all these different things are happening. And it's the people are pretty much just doing the same things. It's just the scale has changed, right? And still at the end of the day, kind of what you were just getting at, the Guru was the Guru. The truth is the truth. We can do all these things and we can analyze and study, or we can just follow the simple things we understand, or we can make artwork, or we can help spread the word. All these things happen in the Guru's times too. So I know that people have, there's two ways people think about it. Sometimes people think of, the Sikhs in the Guru's times, they had blue damala with orange kamar kasa, and they all did everything in unison. They said Fateh in unison. They rode their horses together. And it's like this image that they created, and everything was perfect because the Guru was there. Well, we know that's not true. People betrayed the Guru also, right? People fought against the Guru after having spent time with him for so long. So we know that human beings are consistent, I guess is what I'm getting at. Right.
And just to add to that as well, like a great example that I like to use is in Guru Gobind Singh Ji's army, he himself had employed a number of Muslims from Bahadur Shah. And actually Guru Gobind Singh Ji fought alongside Bahadur Shah during one of his battles, kind of towards the end of Maharaj's life. I think what you've touched upon there, though, is quite beautiful. And I guess in a sense is what the Soch podcast tries to achieve, which is, and again, it's kind of, I guess, a result of some of the studies I got to do during university, which is Sikhi isn't homogenous, and it never, no offense, it never has been homogenous. The process to homogenize it through things like the Death Viryada in the 30s is wrought with contradictions and issues and problems. So I'll give you an example. The Death Viryada in the 30s says not to read Jope Sahib after Pori 24 because it refers to essentially the female divine. Now, go to the Buddha Dal, go to any Nihung Singh and tell him, don't read Jope Sahib after 24, he'll probably cut your head off. Now, and this is the thing, and actually at the heart of it, what comes first then? Does the Ret Viryada come first, or does Satkar for the Guru come first, in that we don't essentially cut bits out, right? There's all sorts of other contradictions in there, but that for me is quite an interesting, and to be honest, it's quite a clear-cut one. I don't think you can necessarily argue against that.
Yeah. But even something like that, I don't know about arguing against it, but the idea that all these people with these different backgrounds had to come to a consensus and do anything with consensus. I mean, when was the last time you ever heard Sikhs being able to have consensus on anything? So essentially you have people saying it's this much, some people saying it's this much, some people saying this much. Well, the consensus is we all agree on this part, right? That becomes a consensus. Now you cut out things and you may be cutting out legitimate things, but that's the problem with consensus building is you're taking things down to a minimum. And but the idea is you're doing this in hope and in faith that the guru is protecting the process. So I'm not as overly critical of things like that. I see that at that time, the role that it played to maybe keep, because this Arya Samaji movement that happened, that's continuing today, really started then, right? That's where Singh Sabha movement started, was out of this Arya Samaj movement. And it splintered because they were criticizing the gurus. So they splintered and kind of started their own thing. So it's really a continuous thing. It's hard to manage things like that. They're too big, they're too clunky, and they're all man-made. They're all our doing, right? So it's going to be problematic. But I take your point. I think that's important for us to realize that there's going to be shortcomings, there's going to be problems, and there's going to be conflicts. And we need to not focus so much on those. Yes, academically we should. Research-wise, we should. People should be researching and giving the argument why after the 24th border you should continue reading or why you shouldn't. Let them do the debates. We should be able to see these debates. We should be able to read their work and make our own decisions or support one way or the other. But I think this is the problem. We can't do that because we're stuck in a belief. We're stuck in our defined belief system, and we've chosen a side without having any knowledge.
I think, though, that last sentence perfectly summarizes what the process that resulted in the death of Miranda is, though, which is that, like, I don't blame anyone for doing what they did, and I understand the need at the time and the requirement for it. But the problem is with that then is you've got a knock-on effect. So a good kid then gets standardized to only print to that body. So people actually don't even know why that happened. So for argument's sake, I grew up with the standard the Gurdwara, or when you go to your daddy's house, and it would stop at body 24. You would never question it. You never knew.
You wouldn't even know. Right.
Then imagine in another 100 years.
Right.
And let's say for argument's sake, let's say for argument's sake, the history of the Ret Mirada, or kind of the Ret Mirada existing, kind of disappears for some reason.
Yeah.
Then it becomes kind of part of popular ideology that Chopi Sahib only ends up to body 24.
Right.
And for me, I'm not...
And it becomes dogma. It essentially becomes dogma.
And I'm not critiquing this in order to say, they got it wrong. I'm pointing it out to say, that doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense because of X, Y, Z, A, B, and C. So, for argument's sake, even in the process of creating the Ret Mirada, they're answering a question which has put them in a position where they have no power. They are not the Ret Mirada is not defining what a Sikh is. It's answering the question from the process such as the Arya Samaj and the British colonialism, which is, who is a Sikh? Now you've got to remember, they're asking that within a particular framework. So do you have a defined origin of time? Right. Do you have a concept of God? Do you have a social religious rituals? So do you have a Nanth Gardage? Do you have a birth ceremony? Do you have a death ceremony? Do you have a naming ceremony? All of this. And if you look at the history even of the Nanth Gardage, all of a sudden it starts to become more common, more in terms of the modern ritual, so to speak, that we have are again around that time. Now, again, it's not to say that's wrong. And again, that was playing its own role in helping to demarcate what at that time they thought Sikhi was. But just as they thought then, we're doing the same thing. And I think, as you were saying, if we're still the same, we should still then be allowed to evolve in the same manner, which is actually, the evidence is unsurmountably, in my opinion, and again, I'm happy for people to disagree, which is it's insurmountably in favor of the fact that you should read Chaupe Sahib completely. It shouldn't stop at Body 24. And I'm not saying that because I'm a great academic and I think I've got the definitive answer. I'm saying that because I don't know of anyone, unless they're literally kind of like new to Sikhi, who does stop at Body 24. Even some of the most ardent AKJs that I know and some of the most ardent kind of missionaries that I know, they will read Chaupe Sahib fully. Now, that's a really random example, but it just gives you an idea of kind of what, I guess, in some ways the podcast is trying to do, which is, all right, we have these complexities as a result of our history. Let's make sense of them to some degree. Let's give you kind of some idea of what the heart of the debate is. So with the Dasam Granth, I'm sure you can kind of attest to that, which is most of the podcast is me just putting forward critiques, and they're not mine because I don't share them, right? Like I don't, like for me, they aren't critiques because in my opinion, I've already got the answer and already have kind of the understanding to it. But it's essentially, these are all of the critiques people have sent in. They're also the most common critiques. What's the answer? Because I think if we just fall back into this common kind of Sikhs are this, Sikhs are that, Sikhs believe in X, Y, and Z, Sikhs do A, B, and C, in my opinion, I think that's kind of a travesty because Sikhi is so deep, it's so beautiful, it's it's got a philosophy. So for argument's sake, the podcast on Vedant for me was a roller coaster because I was like, wow, I never knew any of this.
No, that was really good.
And you understand all these connections. And again, it relates. I think that podcast is a really good way of portraying how Sikhi evolves out of a great, grander civilization of the Indic or the Hindu or whatever you want to call it. In a similar way, like you were saying earlier about Superman, a good analogy that I like to use is the West often says that it traces its kind of civilization back to the Roman and the Greeks. And a lot of the time, through a lot of kind of their popular history, there'll be kind of these incarnations of these gods and goddesses. So you could argue to some degree Captain America and Superman are kind of like your modern day your gods and your goddesses.
Yeah, the Greek gods and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. That doesn't
actually, some of them actually are like
Thor
Shazam, Thor, Wonder Woman,
exactly. And now that's not to say then, just like you were going at the like with your point at the start of the podcast, which is that's not to say that we're praying to them or that we're kind of admiring them in the same sense of kind of ik or God or whatever. And I think that's the same thing here, which is with Vedant. And with Sikhi, it evolves out of a system that already exists, but it's being critiqued, it's being refined, and it's being evolved. So, for argument's sake, like Guru Nanak Dev Ji's a lot of people try to claim Guru Nanak Dev Ji's leader or spiritual teacher was Kabir and people before him.
Right.
Again, not quite, because again, it's what you're saying is the. Give you another example. When I was at university, we had to do it was like history of Western philosophy or something. And you have to go through all of these Western philosophers. Each one has its own name. It's not like Descartes is like Descartes not under somebody else, so on and so forth.
They have a unique identity.
Exactly. And Guru Nanak Dev Ji and all of the gurus brought that to the table. And that's why there is such a beauty in what Sikhi is, because it's so unique. And it is. It's like it's a complete brilliant experience. And I think that's what kind of that podcast really does for me, which is it goes to show how, we are unique, we are completely separate, but we've evolved out of this different system. And actually you have to understand certain bits from, like, for argument's sake, there's a quote in Dasam Granth, I think, which Bhankti in Dasam Granth, which mentions something to do with how it's describing anger and how your anger is as bad as that of Duryodhan.
Yeah.
Now you would not understand that. You had no idea who Duryodhan is unless you've seen or read Mahabharata.
Right.
And then you go, oh yeah, makes sense. Okay, so and then you go, all right, maybe Mahabharata then isn't actually history. Maybe perhaps it's trying to tell me something a little bit deeper. And then you're like, why are there so many similarities? Like, what's going on? And it's not to say that they're the same, but again, like with the Greeks and with the Romans in the West, you can see where there are these connections. And I think...
Yeah, well, even all the mythology, Greek, Roman, Hindu, whatever you want to say, all these mythologies are there to teach lessons, right? They're to guide people in their life. Don't have too much ego. Don't have too much pride. Don't get too angry. Don't do, the consequence of jealousy is that, these stories are there to guide people in how to live. And so, yeah, you're right. Now, if we have a source like the Guru who kind of cuts through it all and says, first and foremost, this information is not only accessible by elites. I'm going to give this information to everybody. So now everybody can be just equally knowledgeable. That was one thing that Satnam Singh, when he was talking, it really clicked with me that the Guru Gobind Singh created a darbar of information gathering, politics, music, debate, art, history, all these different mathematics, astronomy, everything. And the idea was have these experts compile this information and distribute it to common people, to everybody, and not just elite people. And the media he used was the best technology they had at the time, which is a granth. You write it all down, you make copies, and you distribute it. That was today he'd be using YouTube. You know what I mean? Like they used the best technology at the time to get this information to everybody. Well, just rewinding though, real quick, when you were talking about how Maryada can become dogma, and we forget the reason why the Maryada is there, like you mentioned in the Nand ceremony, Anand Karaj. Well, that was there because Sikhs are being denied a certain identity. So if you understand that Anand Karaj ceremony was created to solve that problem, then you can fundamentally understand that we can change it to whatever we want, whenever we want. Because it's not, the dogma isn't in the ritual, right? If we had a different reason, we could come up with a different ceremony. And I think of Maryada like that throughout. One example that comes to mind is the printing of Guru Granth Sahib. If you go and you ask people, how many pages are in Guru Granth Sahib? Everybody has answer either 1429 or 1430, depending on how you view Ragmala. Everybody's got this set answer. Well, that's only because that's our printing press. It's a set template. We standardized it. Now, there's a consequence to that people don't think about. And maybe we need to think about this in the digital age. But the old granths, some of them were 900 pages, some were 700, some were 1500. It could vary depending on how big you wrote and where you broke your lines. They varied. And people skipped pages. And when they would handwrite beards, they would also write other things into the Guru Granth Sahib, like before and after. And when how we put the Ramale inside the cover. So this is something I'd heard. I haven't verified this, but I had heard that what people used to do is they used to put the Ramale in between the Gurbani pages. So the pages before and after that had other notes, historical references, birth records, things like that, they would not include that inside the Ramale when they would do Prakash. But my point was, if you have random different pages, different granths everywhere, when you do a random hukumnama, you will get all kinds of random different shabads. Now, because we standardize the printing and we have a certain way that we open in the middle, and open it up, the same few shabads are constantly coming up as hukumnamas, and our pais are now experts at those shabads, and they know how to get it to the right pages. Spot, get to those, you know what I mean? Like, it's like we fixed one thing, made it easy to distribute Guru Granth Sahib, and we created this other problem that we're not even paying attention to. And out of that is coming this religiosity, this religious practice in the Gurdwaras of pais that are kind of controlling it once again, controlling the information, controlling the ceremony, controlling the ritual, and creating this priest type class.
And just to add to that, like, as a historian, you could imagine there's a lot to say even in the process of getting to that point. So give you a really good example. Cambridge University's library a few months ago came across the fact that they have in their collection a copy of the Guru Granth Sahib Ji that ended up in the library after the Second Anglo-Sikh War. Oh. Somehow it got into the hands of the British and it ended up coming back to England, and it's been, from what I can gather at the moment, in the Cambridge collection ever since.
Oh, wow.
Now, what's interesting with that is it has the Bani from the only female that's included in the Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji, Mirabai.
Right.
Now, the contention with that is that some argue it's Kachi Bani and some argue that it's actual Bani that was included by the Gurus. But again, that's just to demonstrate that at a time before the printing press and the standardization of the Guru Granth Sahib Ji, you have these beautifully variant Granths. Right. On top of that, you've also got a problem, though, which is you've got people, again, that come from within the Guru's family, like the Tirmaliya, and other fringe groups, I guess is what we'd call them now, or sects that splinter off during the history of the Gurus, who essentially are contending for the Guruship.
Right.
And what I mean by that is, at the same time Guru Har Gobind Sahib Ji sat on the Guru Gaddi after Guru Arjan Dev Ji Shahidi, Guru Arjan Dev Ji's own brother is conspiring against his own nephew.
Yeah, right.
And that's just one example, and it goes on, and it's almost a continuation for quite a lot of the Gurus, and kind of having to deal with essentially being kind of contested for the Guru Gaddi. Now,
right.
And then amongst that, a result of that is these sects and these groups write their own material. Right. So amongst what we would class today as the Art Granth, the result of the writing of Guru Arjan Dev Ji and the compilation of Guru Arjan Dev Ji, they're also Granths that are produced by the Tirmaliya amongst other sects. So in a way, you can see how the standardization of the Guru Granth Sahib Ji makes sense, because we've approved that this is the Guru's Bani. Yeah, this is what is from the hand of the Guru, and not, for argument's sake, Deedmal or somebody else. Right. However, during that process of standardization, you lose a lot. So for argument's sake, Gurmukhi was written in Larivar. So even the ability to write that is something that's probably very, very kind of limited today. On top of that, I'm sure you've seen some of these beautiful manuscripts are decorated in the borders. Also, there's
artwork and stuff around the edges.
Yeah, it's an art. It's completely an art. And then to add to that, you've also amongst that got stuff, for argument's sake, like the Mandheer Singh recension, which is a compilation of the Dasam Granth Guru Granth Sahib Ji, along with his explanations of certain passages, history, portraiture, and other such things, right? Unfortunately, that doesn't exist anymore today, or it's no longer extant, but it gives you an idea of the use, as you were saying, of the best technology at the time, and the ability to amass information that was relevant to the masses and put it out there. And then again, with the process of standardization now, you've then got the problem of, to be quite honest, we've probably printed way too many. And on top of that, we've got so many good daughters, we can't really look after them, or we haven't put in the infrastructure to look after them. So every other day you hear of a Bayadbi case in India. Now, I know India is a completely different kettle of fish. You've got a whole state essentially mechanized against minorities. However, if we've got the ability to print, I don't know, say 10,000 Guru Sahibs, we've got to have then the infrastructure in place to look after them, because I think, for argument's sake, you wouldn't have that. You wouldn't have that if, for argument's sake, you knew it took 6 months to write out a copy of the Guru Granth Sahib Ji. Whereas nowadays, I kind of think that there's...
So what you're saying really is, because we can print them, not that we don't revere the Guru or that we don't have these feelings, but there's a part of us that our security comes a notch down because we can easily replace it.
we don't value it really.
We don't value it the same way.
Yeah. Right? And that's not to say we don't have the same Shraddha and respect for Guru Granth Sahib Ji, but I just think like, imagine if the local Gurdwara in Punjab knew that copy of the Guru Granth Sahib Ji took a year and a half to put together and cost twice the amount of the actual building.
Yeah.
I am pretty sure there will be security. More. Yeah. And I'm not saying that's a solution to the problem, but I think it gives you, it's just kind of my understanding of the top.
I totally get what you're saying, but I part of me is still like, your relationship with the Guru is very personal. I'm not against more copies. I'm not against Sikhs having copies, accessing the Guru directly. Like I said, to me, it's information dissemination, and this, on something that's very important, a spiritual level or whatever you want to say, philosophical level. So I'm not against it in that sense, but I definitely hear what you're saying about our reverence, not just in the sense that we treat it like it's the sacred thing, but then also that it is a valuable thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
No, it's an interesting point.
And I think, and that's not to like, I'm sure there is more to what's going on to India than just by like superficial analysis sat over here on a podcast, but it gives you an idea of actually maybe the process standardization, as you were referring to in the other case, is we've kind of resolved one problem, but we've created another one.
Right.
And it's kind of like, well, again, I think a theme that keeps occurring is, as Sikhs, we need to be able to keep evolving and moving with the issues that are pressing against us. And I think obviously what's happening there is one case.
No, absolutely. That's the biggest thing. We need to be able to be nimble and move and evolve to match the times. If anything, that's the whole point of creating a Panth, is that the Panth can govern for the times. The Panth can act as the Guru for the times, and the Guru Granth Sahib is your main central spiritual hub, right? So we're kind of losing that because we're getting stuck in this dogma of here's this religion, here's how it's defined, and somebody else comes along and says, yeah, well, I disagree with what you're doing there. I'm going to define it a little bit differently. And now all of a sudden you have a whole new group of people that define Sikhi certain way, and then they're so dedicated to it, right? Yeah. And then it's just causing infighting in the Sikhs. We're our own worst enemy, right? We're the ones that, I thought of this when you brought up about, you were asked to start a podcast and you thought, you're already doing it, I'd rather support you. And this is something I was always saying, even back in the 90s, making websites, there was this effort to like control everything. Like, no, don't let them start a separate website. We should do it together. And I was always the opposite. I was like, no, make a ton of websites, put a ton of stuff out. I love it that you have a podcast, and it's not like mine. It's different.
Yeah.
It's way better, by the way. Podcast, you can actually, if you want to actually spend time and learn things and get a new perspective, your podcast is perfect for that. And I really, really hope like the people that listen to my podcast, check yours out, because you will learn a lot. And some of the stuff I wasn't so interested in, some of the music ones, or some of the more contemporary things, but which is fine. There's an audience for that too. I get that. But when hearing about like the racism, is it Dr. Jagjit? Was it Jasjeet or Jagjit?
Oh, Dr. Jasjeet. Yeah.
Jasjeet. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Jasjeet,
yeah. He was talking about like with his son and the things he experienced, and some of the things he was talking about were very relatable. I think him and I are probably similar age. I'm going to turn 49 next week. So, but like I really enjoyed that one, but hearing the different perspectives and keeping an open mind, that's the only way we're going to be able to keep up with the times. And that's why, even whether you support the Rathmada or you're against it, you need to be able to think critically about it and understand its purpose, not get stuck on its existence. Right?
I think just on that point, I think going back to the earlier kind of story about how I had the pleasure to sit in a room with people like Gomaru, Satpro, Jagraj, my father, whatever, so on, which is that exemplified for me the kind of thing you always hear about Maharaja Ranjit Singh Ji's kingdom, and kind of all of these missiles
right?
Which at some point are fighting one another.
They're fighting each other, yeah.
so give you a little bit of a historical nugget. Everyone, I think Sikhs worldwide would hold the names of Jassa Singh Ramgarhia and Jassa Singh Ahluwalia in very high esteem.
Right.
Now, if I tell you Jassa Singh Ramgarhia shot Jassa Singh Ahluwalia through the arm, you would probably go, I want to find out a little bit more about why that happened.
Right. Like, why would he do that?
Yeah. But again, another example, Jassa Singh Ramgarhia is employed by the Mughal Muslim forces at that time. Jassa Singh Ahluwalia tells him to jog on. I'm not getting involved. But Jassa Singh Ramgarhia gets all his buddies employed by the imperial forces. So as far as he's concerned, him, his buddies, the families, everyone's being looked after, fed and clothed, right?
Right.
Now, I'm not here to try and break your understanding or your beliefs or anything like that. All I'm there to try and do is take the popular image. And I think that's something that I learned during my history degree, which is take a popular image and go, all right, what's the truth to this? So for argument's sake, coming from a Turkhan family and all the rest of it, Jassa Singh Ramgarhia obviously holds a particular place in the history. So I was like, all right, I wonder why. The other thing that you mentioned about kind of like Sukh from Sikh Archive encouraging me to do the podcast, I think one thing, again, that comes out of examples like people like Jassa Singh Ramgarhia and Jassa Singh Ahluwalia is collaboration is key. And we can disagree. Like, so for argument's sake, people can come at me and can say, look, you're an idiot. You don't know what you're on about. The Rayat Mirad that they made in the 30s is the document. And that's all we need. And I'll say, fine.
You know, it's funny. Let's hang on real quick before you continue. I actually argued with somebody who was so pro Rayat Mirad that he said it is the greatest accomplishment in Sikh history, even more than Guru Granth Sahib. And and I was like, what? But this was his argument. His argument was, look, the Gurus were perfect. It's easy for them to create a perfect Granth. The Rayat Mirad that was created by flawed humans, it is a near impossibility to get flawed humans to agree and build. I was like, okay, I get what you're saying, but dude, that's just too far. That's just going too far.
And again, what you've highlighted is that like we make these really short-sighted conclusions, and then we just rest our life on it. And we go, all right, right. Like that's my life done. But the reality is far from the truth. And I think one thing that I really enjoy, and again, when you got in contact and said, let's do a podcast, like it was just yes, automatically, because collaboration is key. And again, like I don't need to agree with you. You don't need to agree with me. Right. I don't want you to agree with me because the world would be so boring. Imagine if we all thought the same thing. Imagine if we all like it just would be crap. And to be honest, Sikhs, and just like all human beings, we have never, ever agreed on the same thing ever. Yeah. Yep. Even think about the debates today that are raging on. Do Sikhs eat meat? Is Ragmala part of Gurbani? Is Keski a Kakar? Is Dasam Granth even the writing of Guru Gobind Singh? Right. Like the list goes on and on and on. And a lot of these conversations have been going on forever. Like think about Pai Khan Singh Nabaz Hum Hindu Nahi. Yeah. When like I'm not a Hindu essentially. Yeah. That same conversations happen still today. People are still like Sikhs are Hindus. And to be fair, I guess in a sense, I've learned from our history by actually kind of researching our history. So I've learned in a lot of ways, and other people can say, well, actually collaboration, it's just kind of common sense. Like you're a bit of an idiot. Why did you have to go through such a long-winded process to figure that out? But I think you can take a lot from the past. So just to even know, all right, I'll give you another example. Adoption, random tangent, but adoption within the Sikh community is probably unheard of, right? I've never ever come across a Sikh family who's adopted anybody in my own personal life, right? Okay, yeah. Not to say it doesn't happen. No, it does. I know a couple people. Yeah,
like, but it is rare. It is extremely
very rare. Yeah,
I know where you're going with this. Please.
Now the history is after the Seb Sadh's Shahidi, after Guru Gobind Singh Ji passes away, I can't remember which one of his wives is still alive, and I don't want to get it wrong, but she's at that point in time, she's in Delhi, and it's just before she helps to bring up Jassa Singh Ahluwalia.
Right.
And she essentially adopts a son, and she names him Ajit, and she looks after him. Eventually, he tries to set himself up as the guru, so Mataji basically tells him to jog on, and kind of he dies quite lonely. But imagine if that was part of the popular history of Sikhs.
Right, you don't hear that. You don't ever hear that.
And then imagine the influence and the impact that that would have. So just, I think the stigma that is often attached to adoption perhaps would not be there as much if that story was part of popular history and kind of like part of our popular knowledge and narrative within Sikhi. Right. And so it's also interesting as a historian to look at these things and go, I wonder why that's not as commonly known as certain other things. Yeah. And then you start digging into like the processes of how things come about, why things come about, and all the rest of it. But yeah, I think the key to that is collaboration's key. And in essence, I think that's what Sikhs, not to like define us into a tiny ass box, but like collaboration is something Sikhs are really good at. Like we've had to create things out of nothing, and a lot of the time it is done by working with other people. And on top of it, one thing that you've said throughout this conversation is being in an echo chamber is really boring. Right. So if I'm with people all the time who aren't questioning me, aren't pushing me. So for argument's sake, the fact that Soch from Sikh Archive pushed me to do the podcast. Right. At first I was a little bit reluctant, but then I thought, actually, why not? Because then I can, like, we can just bring in different viewpoints, different perspectives. And another thing that I failed to mention at the start when you were asking me about why kind of like you wanted to do the podcast, I think something that I've noticed, and to be honest, it's pretty much a global thing, which is within the UK, the Black community, Black culture is so strong. It's brilliant. It's amazing to see it, especially considering they've had to deal with, in a lot of situations, a lot worse racism and kind of obstacles that than kind of brown people or we've had to face. But there's like, you name it, there is like a show, there is a conversation, there is something or another within popular culture happening in relation to the Black culture, Black community, whether that's history, whether that's philosophy, art, whatever it is. Even if whatever people's opinions are of Black Lives Matter, but Black Lives Matter, and even the fact that where they get their inspiration from, and you can look at things like the Black Panthers and whatever else. Right. And so for me, I was almost seeing all of this, and I was like, Sikhs are probably one of the, I think collectively, there's the second most richest religious community within the UK. We have the
resources, we have the education, we have the money. And if we actually got together and put that brain power and resources together, there's so much we could accomplish.
But instead, we've got 5 or 6 Sikh channels, which are all pretty much kind of producing the same content, and it's the same kind of narrative, and it's a similar demographic for a very particular audience, which by and large isn't a audience that wasn't born in India or in Africa or whatever. So in some ways, the podcast came out as a result of, all right, I'll do it. Not like I will do it on my own, but as in I can be part of something. And one thing that I kept seeing was you have all of these different artists, creative directors, or like you name it, there is someone doing it really well. And that's not to say there aren't brown people or Sikhs or whatever, South Asians in these roles, but I haven't seen like a talk show with a few, doesn't have to be Sikhs, but just South Asians sat there discussing, all right, how is it to grow up in the UK during the 21st century or whatever? What problems do we have to face? And the podcast in some ways is to try and help people listening to understand their own kind of worldview and perspective. Because I think from personal experience, when I was at secondary school, I went through this whole kind of identity crisis of, I look like this, I don't fit in with my peers. Right.
Right.
I'm not white. I don't meet kind of the typical kind of image of a British lad or whatever you want to define it as. Like, who am I? Why do I look like this? Why am I so different? And I remember having a conversation with my dad going like, I don't like this. Like, why do I automatically feel different when I'm around these people? And obviously kind of he explained, and kind of we got through that. And so in some ways the podcast is to go, all right, look, we do exist. We do face these problems. You're not kind of on your own. When you come across an issue, so for argument's sake, most people out there, when they come across Dasam Granth, they're like, what the hell is this? Yeah. They're like, where has this come from? How does this relate to the Guru Granth Sahib Ji? Or even if it's random historical kind of facts, like, I don't know, the fact that the British had a ban on people who were boxing. They had a ban on beards for boxers until, like, I don't know, like a few years ago or something. Right, and it was a Sikh boxer who helped to overturn it.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's just to try and bring.
No, look, I look at it very simply. Sikhs were created to have a certain identity. The word identity, even, it's identical. The Guru gave us something that made us identical to the Guru. That's our identity, right? Our mission is the Guru's mission. The Guru disseminated information to people. That is our mission. And that's us having this identity and putting our creative efforts into things like podcasts or websites or music or artwork or writing papers or going into academics or even just saying, hey, I want this Sikhi Sarup to be in some popular TV show. Yes, the Sikh character may not be 100% what everybody thinks is the perfect Sikh should be, but that identity is on display and represents people in real life. Like when you were saying that about not fitting in, that's how I always feel. I feel like I'm an American. I was always very American. Okay. The food I like to eat, the music I grew up listening to, Run DMC and Beastie Boys and, old school rap, Michael Jackson. NWA was a little bit later. But you would have, yeah. For me, it was more the early 80s. Right. So,
okay.
But yeah, when Eazy-E and Ice Cube and all that came out, that was like mind blowing. But for me, the nostalgia is still very heavy with like Run DMC and some of the older groups, even rock, Def Leppard, Led Zeppelin, Van Halen. That's the kind of stuff I still, if I hear it, I enjoy it.
Yeah.
But, so I have this American identity, but I don't look like Americans, or I didn't then as much. Nowadays, you see people with beards and stuff, so it's a little bit different here. But I remember having a realization, and this must have been around 15 years old. I was like, because I was debating whether I was going to keep my hair or not. So I kept my hair when I was 13-ish, 8th grade, 13, 14. And I kept thinking all that time for a couple of years, I'm going to cut my hair. I'm only trying this out. This is stupid. I'm not going to do this my whole life.
Yeah.
Okay. But something happened where I felt like, okay, I'm convinced I'm never going to, I'm going to stick with this. But I remember having this thought in my head of, I'm different than everybody else. I'm already different. I'm just going to be a little more different. It's impossible for me to fit in 100%, but it's very easy for me to be just a little bit more different. And once I kind of came to terms with that, I think I felt a lot more comfortable in my skin, because then I realized I can have my own identity, which is partly American. It's partly Sikh. Yeah. Everybody can tell you there's no part of me that's very Punjabi, but there is, there's still the connection. There's still the history. There's where our family's from, so, and I understand and relate to a lot of that. But for me, the Sikh identity came up to the forefront, and then everything else is secondary. But I still had to find that, you know what I mean? I still had to find that comfort of, okay, I am American, but I'm not like all the other Americans. And it's up to me to define how I want to be. Right. So I can totally relate to you when you're saying that.
Well, just even like understanding what those labels mean and what they mean to you and how they pan out in the real world. So for argument's sake, I think a lot of people get caught up on when they're like, am I Indian or am I Punjabi?
Right.
And it's like, well, and it's like, I can understand the issue because the Indian nation state,
right.
like, let's face it, isn't any friend of the Sikhs.
Right.
But at the same time, the Indian subcontinent is an area which we hail from.
Right.
So
it's a geographic thing. Right.
Yeah. So it's like, things are complicated. And I think one thing with life is we really try to simplify things to like a basic yes, no. Do Sikhs eat meat?
Black and white.
Do Sikhs believe in Ragmala? Do Sikhs accept the Dasam Granth to be the writing of Guru Gobind Singh? Ultimately, the answers to any of that, in my opinion, don't matter. Whether you agree or disagree is the beauty of the fact that we get to experience what we have, which is our life at the moment. But fundamentally, going to the basics or like the kind of the crux of what Sikhi is it's your internal journey to get back to the source.
Right.
Again, quite a crude definition, but you get what I'm trying to point at. So all of this is almost like an intellectual exercise that I really enjoy. And in some ways, it's also quite selfish, if I'm completely honest, because in some ways I want to create something that helps to dominate the culture within Britain, because there's been loads of examples where you've had people who've done podcasts or have done YouTube have got to a certain size and then move into things like radio, TV, whatever. Now, I don't have any plan in mind, but for argument's sake, when I see, and again, you can have your opinions of him, but when I see someone like Sidhu Moosewala doing a UK rap song, I'm like, oh, it's a Singh.
It's amazing. Again, it's still amazing. Whether you like him or not or whatever, it's still an amazing thing to see that.
Exactly. And when I see the British boxer in the Bassi boxing, again, I love it. It's as close as we're going to get to us, to me, to you, on the stage, just doing what he does. It doesn't have to be something that we accept or not. So some people might not like the fact he's a boxer, but hey, like, that doesn't matter.
Right.
It's just doing that. And I think, so for me, it was almost like a dilemma of, all right, I can see a problem, or not a problem, but I can see that we don't have, I guess crudely put, we don't have a non-religious space where we can discuss openly. And what I mean by that is, in some respects, as you were saying, which is dogma really gets in the way, and it's kind of like, oh, you can't say that because how dare you disrespect the Guru? So for argument's sake, some people would really get offended by even the idea that some of the Gurus had more than one wife. Now, that can be for various reasons, modern sensibilities, kind of the Victorian Christianization of Sikhi, whatever. But we still need to be able to have those conversations, and we still need to be able to have them in a healthy, constructive manner. So if you and I just start having an argument over it, what's the point? We're wasting our time.
Yeah. You know, you're right. Because like some of these things they're cultural and they're based on the time period, right? Like we know that marriages happened very young. The families would get together, they'd do the marriage, and then most of the time they would move in together later. But we wouldn't even consider that today, right? That wouldn't even be something we would consider. I've even argued to people that even the concept of an arranged marriage between adults is a human rights violation. People get mad at me when I say that, but I'm like, you're taking away the choice of a human adult. Like, and I'm talking about strictly, you don't even see that anymore, really. Not modern day arranged marriage where, oh, there's this boy, you should talk to him. There's this girl, you should email them. Or I'm talking about like strictly where the fathers of two families have already made a decision that their children are going to get married because they're kind of bringing their families together. They made the decision for everyone. I'm talking strictly in that sense, which is probably rare. But so even that culturally, it doesn't fit in our time period, in our sensibilities today. So with multiple wives, you know, I have a certain idea about what I think the Gurus were like. But then I also think, I know, like, even just the generation before my parents, you saw often that the man married a woman, she could not have any children, and then he would marry another woman, and they would all still live in the same household, but now his wife, he's wife and his relationship is with the new wife who is going to bear children. The old wife was still there because now she was his responsibility. She had left her home. She had left her parents' home and was not to go back. So she would stay there and almost be like a nanny to the new wife and kids.
Or there'd be examples of like, I don't know quite when this kind of like dissolved out or whether it still happens, but it'd be like when I think it was the older brother would pass away, then the younger brother would marry the wife.
Yeah.
And so
and today we would be like, absolutely. Crazy. Yeah, that's crazy. There's no way. But that's a very common cultural practice. And the fact that the gurus wouldn't practice the similar culture doesn't make sense. You know, like it not that they did everything. Obviously things that were, you know, like the whole thing about the wives throwing themselves on the funeral pyre of their dead husband. Obviously, those were cultural practices too, but they had a human rights component to it, and they had a religious, unnecessary ritual component to it that the guru is attacking. So I think we can distinguish those and say, oh yeah, the guru wouldn't expect a Sikh woman to jump into the fire of her dead husband, but other cultural things, like you just mentioned, marrying the older brother, if the older brother passed away, marrying his wife, or like the example I gave about if the first wife couldn't have children. These were common things. So I say, and this is where I kind of get in trouble, but I tell people all the time, I go, look, if you already have a view of Sikhi and you're into Nam-Bani, you do your path every day and you're happy, don't ever read history. Don't even read it. It's just gonna put doubt in your mind about things you're not even thinking about. But if you want to know the truth, if you really want to know the truth, you've got to read history and you got to look for clues. You got to look for the clues to give you an idea of what was happening at that time.
Definitely. But I think also, like, for me, I find it funny that we have individuals who spend all their time kind of understanding Gurbani and then getting, kind of colloquially speaking, their knickers in a twist when they get to history. Because for me, like, Gurbani says, like, there's that beautiful quote written by Guru Gobind Singh Ji, which says, "Inek fir ek." So it's like you've got one that creates onto these multifaceted patterns into this complete beauty that we get to experience. But again, fundamentally, it's just one. Right. And I think for me, understanding stuff like Advaita, duality, the fact that any conversation, just the matter of us talking, is going to create a dualism, because the way that the English language is structured and the way that I have to put something together automatically centers around an I and puts out my view or opinion.
Which is separate from what's around you. Yeah.
Completely. And ultimately, as we keep saying, it doesn't, like, fundamentally, it doesn't mean anything. But you also have to take on the fact and the responsibility that actually it means a lot. So, case in point, the people putting together the Data, just an example that we keep using, they might not at that point have thought what they were doing would have the implications it did. And in their perspective, they definitely thought they were doing the right thing.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
It answered the problems that they were facing at the time.
Yeah, here's a great example of that too. Because this is something that used to come up, college kids, everybody used to say, hey, this is gender bias. It says a Sikh's daughter must marry a Sikh. That's in the Ratmirada, right? So yeah, you're right. There is a gender bias there. Why? So that means a Sikh son can marry whoever he wants, but a Sikh's daughter has to marry a Sikh. Why is this? But the thing is that culturally speaking, at the time, the problem they were addressing is when a Sikh girl married a non-Sikh, she adopted his religion. So we would lose a number. When a non-Sikh girl married a Sikh boy, she would become Sikh and we would gain a number. So to avoid this losing of Sikh women into Hindu families or Muslim families, they try to come up with this rule to say, hey, make sure your daughter marries a Sikh so that we can continue Sikhi in the families. So they had a reason for it, and their reason might have been good, but the way they put it now, or the fact that they created this rule, quote unquote rule, now has people questioning, hey, this is not equal. There's no equality here. So this is a problem now. So again, they fixed a problem and created a different problem.
Yeah.
Right.
And we just need to be able to give ourselves the space to evolve and to move that forward in whatever way. So
100%.
even to look at the text itself and go, all right, where does this come from? So for argument's sake, a Sakhi that's often repeated is I forgot the name, but there's the Gurdwara related to Guru Nanak Dev Ji, where it said that essentially someone threw a stone at Maharaj and he basically stopped the stone.
Yeah.
And Maharaj's handprint is still there.
Right.
Now if you trace the history of that or the writing of that, it doesn't appear in any of the Janam Sakhis. It doesn't come from any kind of literature source within the Sikh setup, right?
Yeah.
Now, that's not to discredit it and say, because it's not written down, it mustn't have been true, because that itself is riddled with all sorts of colonial superstition of the fact that oral history isn't real history, which is absolute bollocks.
Right.
But we need to give ourselves the space to go, all right, well, if that hasn't come from our written source history, where did it come from? And that's not to then question the sanctity of that place or to say that place no longer holds reverence or meaning to millions of Sikhs and non-Sikhs alike because of its connection to Guru Nanak Dev Ji. But all right, where did that come from then? And it's never to have a definitive answer, because I think something that's really beautiful with history is you only get so far as you can take it, and then someone else at some point will hopefully come across it and go, all right, let me develop on that. So even the stuff like Maharaj Ranjit Singh Ji's Kingdom, Dr. Priya Atwell published a book a couple of years ago now, I think, Royals and Rebels, a complete brand new look at the household of Ranjit Singh, which hasn't occurred before, relating it to the culture of the time and everything else that's happening. And that's kind of like, I guess, in a way, pardon me, but in a way, what I'm trying to do with the podcast, which is explore the beauty of Sikhi, the culture, the history, the philosophy, everything that underpins that, and then try and make that digestible for others, and in the process help to try and create a platform that helps to showcase others. So for argument's sake, a lot of the authors that I've interviewed or had the pleasure to talk to, like, I push their work because it's almost like, I know it's quite a stupid saying, but there's this quite colloquial saying of for the culture, and quite unfortunately it fits perfectly, which is it's for the culture, because I know what it felt like at whatever age I was when I was like, what the fuck is going on, essentially. And I don't want, it's not that I don't want others to go through it, because I think everyone obviously has their own karma and all the rest of it. But like, I've got two little nieces who are 7 and 5, and I'm like, all right, it's someone's responsibility to educate them. And then I'm like, what do I even know to?
But you're curating the people, you're curating the experts, putting it together and making it available to everybody. So I can totally, I totally can relate to that, because I think that was one of the things that I also worked on, is when I would try to do a presentation, I would think, man, how would I have liked to have somebody teach this thing to me instead of the standard typical Punjabi uncle auntie thing, Punjabi school thing? You know, how would this really have driven home with me when I was 15 or when I was 18 or 20, you know, and questioning things. So I can totally understand where you're going from that. But I think one thing that you're doing really well, and I hope you keep this up, is you're bringing in not just the mainstream type experts. You're bringing in people that are kind of, you know, on the not even, I don't want to say they're on the controversial side of things, but they understand a perspective really well. And it's not the normal perspective. It's not the common perspective. So to hear that, even to hear Satnam Singh talk about like Bhai Nandlal Ji, like it was pretty in depth. It was pretty interesting. You know, like things, we know general things, but then to kind of really dig in and hear, oh, this is, you know, he was, he was coming from a perspective where he could talk to the Mughals and relate the Guru's ideas, that was a unique position that had to take a certain type of intelligence and a certain type of knowledge that he was uniquely positioned for, talent too, because of the artistry of it. So those kinds of details, you get those when you have somebody who has that deeper, research into things, the deeper understanding of these personalities. But look, definitely. Here, we've been going for a while here. We probably should wrap things. Yeah,
the time has literally just flown past.
Yeah, no, it was great to talk to you. I really appreciate you coming on, and hopefully you can come back. We can talk again.
Yeah.
I really appreciate all the work you're doing, and I really hope my audience takes the time. And even if you don't want to, you got like 30 episodes out now or something. How many episodes?
I think I scheduled episode 31 to go out at the end of February. But yeah, there's 30, like the back catalog at the moment is 30 episodes long.
Yeah. And just so people understand your format, you have questions that you've curated from people online through social media and stuff. And you have your own kind of structure to So
it's kind of evolved and developed over time. So what originally happened was I would contact an individual with something in mind or a topic to cover in mind. And then before doing that, or after sometimes getting confirmation from them, I'd go, all right, what are the questions I want to know?
Okay.
So I think with the podcast with Devinder Toor, when we're discussing his collection, I think people can pick up how excited I am to ask some of the questions, because I actually want to know out of just genuine curiosity anyway. Right. At the same time, to get kind of the community involved and like whoever kind of interacts with Ramblings of a Sikh, I'd sometimes just post out, like, I'm going to talk to this person. If anyone has any questions, just post them below. And that's again because I don't want to do a podcast and then someone's like, oh, why didn't you ask this? Or why didn't you ask that? Or could you have asked this? And on top of it, because the objective is to try and educate or get information to as many people as possible, I obviously want it to be relevant. So with like the Dasam Granth podcast, I had loads of questions, but the beauty of it was you could see one or two questions would always repeat. So you knew these are the must-haves. And then equally it tries now, because it's kind of developed into a video and audio podcast, I try not to edit it as much, but as a result of that as well, things just go on a tangent. So I start with a set number of questions that I just use to help structure the conversation. We might go off on tangents. I might ask you questions that I've not written down. And quite often that happens because I'm listening to something and I'm like, right, what about this? What about that? And then, and it kind of is a mix mash of this, which is very, very just like flowing and kind of natural, and something more like an interview. So it's, I guess, somewhere kind of in the middle.
Well, one thing I appreciate that you do is when you ask a question, you then just let the person answer and talk however they feel they need to clarify the answer to your question. Like you don't really interrupt them. You don't, interject with another question. You don't let them just give a topical answer. You will let people talk and really explain, giving the background, giving the response. And I actually found that particularly interesting with Mandheer Singh, because he had a lot to say, and letting him talk was the best part.
Yeah.
Because you could hear the excitement in his voice too, or you could hear his thoughts, how his thoughts were connecting, and then how it kind of came together. So that's one thing that I think that you do really well. And I think people will appreciate that, because you can actually learn, or at least you can become curious to dig deeper and learn more.
Well, it's almost I guess the atmosphere or the feel that I'm trying to get at is I want you to feel as though you're sat in front of the person you're listening to, having a conversation and just asking them, because I guess in a sense, I'm almost trying to encourage that behavior in those listening to go, all right, just be naturally curious and go question things and go research things and go look into things. now that the podcast has started to grow, we're like on episode 31. I've got episode 32 to edit. I've got a whole host of things lined up. I'm now trying to figure out how I can take this a step further, how I can create kind of more YouTube friendly videos that are kind of more informational, a little bit smaller.
No, I can see you're at the beginning of this. You're going to take off huge, because once people start to, find your podcast and get involved, I can see that this is going to be huge. Another podcast, I was going to get your take on this real quick before I let you go, is Mandheer Singh's Suraj podcast. Have you listened to that?
Of course.
My goodness. Absolutely amazing.
Yeah, you can't question. I had the good fortune of watching his talk that he did with the UKPHA a few years back, when he had just, I think, written the Punjabi Proverbs book. And it was brilliant. And the thing is again, he comes from, or he's interacted with the similar kind of people. So he's learned from the Mandheer Singh. He's gone to Buddha and learned kind of Santhiyar from the Nihungs. I had the fortune again of being quite heavily involved with the Nihungs and taking Amrit from them myself. So to see those similarities was brilliant. To see him kind of talking about similar things was brilliant. To see him bringing our history out to the forefront, it's just, honestly, I can't put into words how it is a great, huge task. First of all, it's not like he's just reading or telling a story. No.
I mean, everything is so well researched and the descriptions are so vivid.
And to add to that, he's translating.
Yes.
So everything he puts together, so for me, the professional quality and feel of his podcast is just untouchable. Yeah. But deeper down within that, what I find amazing is he's translating the history from the text, putting it into English in the best definitions possible, with the reasonings, with everything else, and then providing it to you. And I think that's something that I really appreciate, because it's similar to I think it's similar to the approach I take, which is I'm not here to vet the content. I'm not here. So I think one example he uses, which is great, is Mandheer Singh's copy of Suraj Prakash is heavily redacted and reduced because of the writer's own opinions and feelings. But Jawala's very honest to say that's not his game. He is here to kind of share everything. And just to kind of let the cat out of the bag, I should hopefully be recording a podcast with him in the next coming weeks. So that should be a good one for.
Yeah, I've been trying to get him too. He said he would, but
he's very busy. Yeah, I've been asking him for about a year. Yeah.
Sounds like you're going to get him before I did, though. But that's okay. I think you'll be able to ask him a lot better questions. So I'm going to really look forward to that one. But
thank you.
Yeah, it's those are the probably top 2 Sikh podcasts that I enjoy. Some of the other Sikh podcasts that are out there, they're not really Sikh related. They're just done by Sikhs. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm not that interested in those. I like the ones that are more Sikh related, especially an aspect that I don't myself explore. I don't have the resources. And honestly, I don't have the ability to identify what are the right books to read, what are the right texts to read. So when I hear you talk about something or whatever, then I can make some connections that way. So it's a huge help. But definitely appreciate all your hard work with this. It's a great job. I really, really recommend everybody go listen to the Soch podcast. You can pretty much hear it everywhere. It's on YouTube now. It's on Spotify. It's on all the podcast platforms.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. If you want to find it on YouTube, you can search Ramblings of a Sikh, because that's the
channel.
YouTube account. Yeah, the channel. Yeah. I think if you type in Soch Podcast, it might come up. But again, because variations of the spelling in English, Ramblings of a Sikh, just the easy get-go. On Spotify and all other kind of podcast platforms, you can search for either Ramblings of a Sikh or Soch Podcast, and it will come up. And yeah, it's pretty much everywhere you can imagine. I think it's also on Amazon, whatever, so you can play it on your smart device if you really want to listen to me so much.
Yeah, or listen to it in your truck on a long trip.
Yeah,
That's what I've been
wherever.
doing.
I've had I've had all sorts of weird and wonderful ways which the podcast has been played. I had one gentleman from America send me a photo of his family watching the Untitled podcast on their living room TV.
Oh, wow.
And I was just shocked. I was like, what? I was like, this is nuts. But yeah, and again, you can find it. Yeah, you can find it everywhere. And then socials, again, in terms of like Instagram, it's just Ramblings of a Sikh. Twitter is Rambling Singh. But again, the podcast is probably the best place to get like heavy content and a lot of it.
And I'll put all that information in the links in the description on this too.
Definitely. So yeah. And then the only other thing I could add to that is there is a bookshop essentially, which is kind of
I was going to mention that.
Yeah, which is a sister to the podcast and everything else that happens. It's just simply ramblingsofasikh.shop. We deliver worldwide. And again, I guess what happened was, as I was researching, I would buy some of these books from all over the globe. And it was getting quite expensive. And I was like, all right, I need to make this work for me. But I also think that there's a benefit in sharing all of this with others. And I think if I'm looking for it, I'm assuming others were looking for it. So
it's actually very convenient. You have some of the books that I've always wondered about, and I see them on your site, and I'm like, okay, now I know where I can go to grab this stuff. And then just to also mention, you also have a Patreon page too, right? Like if people want to donate for so we'll put all that into the link.
There's a Patreon page. So thank you obviously for mentioning it. There's a Patreon page which again, obviously I'll share the link with you that you can join to help support the work we're doing. You can also become a paying member on the YouTube channel. I would recommend becoming a paid member on the YouTube channel because that unlocks particular perks. So I think if you pay like $8.99 a month, you'll get early access to all the podcasts. So as soon as I upload it, you'll get to listen to it rather than have to wait for the date at which I've scheduled it.
Okay.
And then on top of it, there's also it's called Ko-fi link. So if you just want to make a random one-off donation, that gives you the benefit to do that. So yeah.
Do you do everything yourself? You do all or do you have anybody helping you at all?
No, so I am just one person who's doing all of this. I do it in my spare. So I work a normal 9 to 5 like everyone else. Often it is a 9 to 7, but I can't complain. And all of this happens in the spare time. So the social media is me, the podcast recording, editing, all of it at the moment is myself. I'm trying to see how I can grow this and see how others can kind of help.
Absolutely.
But
people, I think everybody should donate. And these are the kinds of things we should be encouraging. We want more people like you out there creating more content. And it just helps. It helps us document how we think and feel about things, in 2022. But one piece of advice for you, take care of that voice. So drink the cha with the adrak in it or whatever you have to do, like whatever everybody does to take care of their voice. That voice is golden, man. It sounds great on my speakers in my truck. And I always think you sound so sophisticated that you are perfectly suited for teaching Sikh history to people.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you. I've got to admit, I've never been complimented on my voice before, but I will take it. I'm not going to complain. Like, thank you so much. I actually had one person when I first started the podcast, when we were doing the video podcast, they posted underneath it, I thought you were a child.
What?
And I was like, in my head, I actually said to my wife, I was like, do I have a kid's voice?
No, not at all.
I know. And I was really a bit confused at that. So no, thank you. For that.
Yeah, very good. Okay. Thank you very much. Come back anytime and let's stay in touch and hopefully we can do something again.
No, definitely. I've really enjoyed it. So thank you for having me. We've spoken for at least, I think, like 2 hours and it's flown
I think it's
by.
been at least 2 hours now.
Yeah, thank you for this. And again, feel free to reach out whenever. More than happy to
100%
elaborate and work on whatever. And again, if there's anything that I can help you with, just feel free to let me know. More than happy to help.
Sounds good. Appreciate that. Okay, Amar Singh, Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.